I'm Rob Blackie. I've worked for the party in one form or another as a campaigner, as a member of staff, as a candidate for about 20 years on all sorts of campaigns. I worked for Charles Kennedy on the Iraq War. But I'm here tonight really because my company has as a client Best for Britain, which is one of the leading anti-Brexit campaigns that many of you will know. And so I've spent most of the last year and a half working with them since just before they launched, right up to now, on how we stop Brexit. And so I'm going to outline why I think we can stop Brexit. I'm going to be quite positive about it. I'm not saying it's a certainty by any means. I'm saying it's a possibility, maybe a 1 in 5 chance, maybe a 1 in 4 chance. But I think that's dramatically better than it was a short while ago. I'll start with sort of where are we politically at the moment? Where has the government got to in its negotiations with the EU? Where has the government got to with its negotiations with itself? Then what does that mean for us getting a referendum? Then what about the public? Where are the public? How do they feel about Brexit at the moment? And then what can we do to take advantage of it? So, where are we on Brexit? Britain technically is meant to leave the EU at the end of March next year. And before we do that, we are meant to negotiate 3 different things. And I'm going to take them in sort of reverse order. The first one of which is a long-term trade agreement and a long-term set of agreements with the EU. And it's already been agreed there's no chance of us doing that before March. So we sort of put that to the side. So kind of forget about that. So a lot of the arguments going on at the moment is really about what happens, what's going to be reserved as a backstop to that agreement. Second thing is the transition deal. And that's sort of what happens between March next year and the end of 2020. And there's a very simple answer on that, which is essentially we stay in the EU, but with no decision-making power. So we lose our MEPs, stop participating in decisions, but we take all the EU rules. So if that transition period goes ahead, we'll actually see no change for that year and a half. But it might not go ahead. And the reason it might not go ahead is we have to negotiate our divorce from the EU, what we call withdrawal agreement. And in those negotiations so far, Theresa May's team have so far essentially caved in on almost everything because our negotiation position isn't very strong. And they are really stuck now on one thing to fix. Unfortunately, it's by far the hardest thing, which is Northern Ireland. Some of you will know more about this than others, but when the Northern Irish peace deal was made, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, really it allowed everyone in Northern Ireland to pretend they had got victory. So if you were a unionist in Northern Ireland, you could pretend you still lived in Britain, because you did. And you could have a British passport, and ultimately some of your tax would go to Westminster, and there would be a devolved government in Stormont that was guaranteed to be a coalition between unionists and nationalists because of rules of a peace agreement. So the unionists were kept happy by that. The nationalists were also kept happy because they could pretend they lived in Ireland. There was no border between North and South. There was Stormont government guaranteed to have nationalists in it. They could have Irish passports if they liked, and all sorts of other things that allow people to kind of forget that they lived in the UK. And everyone was happy about that. All of that was based on the idea that we were in the EU, and nobody even imagined us leaving the EU. So it's kind of written into the basis of all the Northern Ireland Peace Agreement. And this really matters because the EU has given Ireland a veto over what happens in the withdrawal agreement. And the withdrawal agreement has to have a backstop for what happens in those long-term trade negotiations if there isn't a customs union between Britain and the EU. And by customs union, in this case, we mean free movement of goods. So things that get moved across a border. And there are really only 3 solutions to this. You either have a border or you don't have a border. And the nationalists and the Irish government are absolutely determined you don't have a border. Now, given that all the 3 biggest parties in the Republic of Ireland are in somehow related to the decision to separate Ireland in the early 20th century, it's a pretty fundamental Irish political issue that is probably not going to be given up. But there's three options, really. The first option is the whole of the UK stays in the customs union forever in some form. And so we have the same rules for goods that the EU does. We have no say in those rules, but we keep all of those rules. And when those rules get updated in Brussels, Britain will have to take them on. That allows goods to go back and forth across the border indefinitely. No border, that's great. The problem is the hardcore Brexiteers and the Conservative Party absolutely hate this because, not unreasonably, they say we become a vassal state and that we take all the EU's laws, but we have no say in them. Now, obviously, that's also a very good argument for staying in the EU, but this is what hardcore Brexiteers think. And if you listen to them at the moment, in one way or another, a lot of what they're saying is a complaint that we can't stay too closely aligned to the EU. Second option is that you have a hard border. Obviously, that's unacceptable to Ireland and to the Northern Irish nationalists. The third option is that you allow Northern Ireland to stay in the EU or in the customs union, but the rest of British Isles leaves. That, of course, means you need some sort of border in the North Sea. So there have to be customs checks when stuff comes back and forth across the sea. If you're going to resolve that problem, somebody has to give way somewhere. And it looks at the moment, depends who you talk to, but it looks at the moment like nobody can get a majority through Parliament for any solution. And of course, what happens by default is eventually we hit 29th of March next year and we fall out with no deal and there's a complete disaster. So sort of, if you think of it, okay, what's going to happen now? Well, one option is Theresa May does place for time and keeps on trying to renegotiate right up to the end of March, and we fall out of the EU, it's a disaster, and then something happens. Who knows what, but it will be mayhem. Even if Britain wanted to rejoin the EU, then that would be a very long and difficult process. So that's a terrible solution, but actually very likely, I would say. Second solution is somebody caves in. And at the moment, it looks like Theresa May is trying to cave in on the customs union and essentially allow the whole of Britain to stay in the customs union indefinitely. They won't quite call it that. They'll try and fudge it in various ways to ameliorate it. But if Theresa May is going to get through Parliament, she needs to keep almost all of her MPs on board because she has a tiny majority, and the Democratic Unionists. So it's quite hard to imagine how she does that, but maybe she does that. One of the things she's doing at the moment is looking around for Labour MPs who will look at no deal with panic and vote for her deal to try and get it through. So she may well lose some Tory Remainers or some Tory Brexiteers or the DUP, but she may gain some Labour MPs. Now, there's about 5 hardcore pro-Brexit Labour MPs, but there's probably about another 15 or 20 who might join and are looking flaky at the moment. So the numbers are very, very unknowable, probably until the moment the vote happens. Obviously, the third option, this is the option sort of I'm hoping for, which is if none of these deals can get through Parliament, it may well be that the MPs say, well, we can't fix it, so we'll throw it to a vote by the British people, and they can choose between the Theresa May deal and remaining in the EU. And I would say it's probably about 1 in 4, 1 in 5 chance of that, and we'd then have to win that referendum. So that's kind of where the politics is. It is astoundingly complex. I can give you 15 more reasons it's more complex than that. Just to give you one, the SNP aren't guaranteed to vote against Brexit. They may try and hold it hostage to getting another Scottish independence referendum, and that's just another angle. But there's hundreds of scenarios, but most of them seem to look at there is no way to get a majority in Parliament for any deal. So if that happens, we have a referendum. And suddenly the opinion of British people becomes very, very important here. And we know quite a lot about that. Partly my client, Best for Britain, have done a lot of research, but there's also been a lot of public research over the last 2 years. So the first thing we know is that at a headline level, if people voted again today, our best guess is people would vote 52% Remain. Literally a mirror image of where we were 2 years ago. It's a small but consistent shift. Lots of polls have shown this. And it's not because lots of people who voted Leave have switched. It's actually mainly because people who didn't vote 2 years ago are much more likely to vote. And there's a few other things as well. There's also been a slight shift of Labour people who voted Leave towards Remain. Actually, basically, just Theresa May banging on about about Brexit the whole time has shifted a whole load of Labour voters away from Brexit, but it's also shifted a whole load of Conservative Remainers towards Brexit. So first thing we know is we would hope we had a good chance of winning, but it's looking extremely narrow if you just ask people today. But it turns out if you pull under the surface, there's a thing that psychologists call consistency, which is people like to stay consistent to what they've done before. So if you ask them, how do you vote in another referendum? What people do as a psychological shortcut is they think, how did I vote last time? So for this reason, never say you voted Leave, you're wrong, please change your mind, because then you'll strengthen the identity as a Leave voter in their minds. Always say, just give people a positive argument for voting for Remain, and people can shift themselves. Sometimes people will actually forget, consciously or unconsciously, how they voted before. And actually, we want them to do that. So first thing is we probably win. So second thing is which asking people is not very helpful in terms of getting underlying attitudes. So if you dig into those underlying attitudes, there's some really interesting things, most of which are very positive for us. The first one of which is, and this will probably be astounding to anyone in this room, most people haven't been paying attention to what's going on in Brexit. I was involved in a focus group a few months ago in Midlands where a young man who had voted Leave a couple of years ago said, you know, I voted Leave, don't feel I've heard about it since. And that's not a completely uncommon point of view. Now, saying you haven't heard about it at all is probably an extreme example, but most people haven't paid close attention. So there's a poll that populists do every week that says, what's the biggest news story you've noticed this week? The average percentage who named Brexit as the story they'd most noticed in the news this week. Anyone want to guess what it was in April of this year? 10? Yeah. 5%. Two was the closest, 3%. 3% of people on average weren't noticing in April. Nobody was paying attention to Brexit in April. And it's grown quite quickly. So it's now more like 25, 30% each week. So it's almost 10 times the level of interest we had it back in April. So the public are starting to tune in because of discussions of no deal and all the crises and all that sort of stuff. So the public are starting to pay attention, but they're only now starting to pay attention. That means there's still actually quite a lot of people. It's about 1 in 5 people, I would say, across the country who are winnable to voting for Remain in the future referendum. Now, some of those people voted Remain last time. About half of them voted Remain last time, about half of them voted Leave. Sort of flaky Remainers and sort of soft Leavers. So there's sort of open-mindedness generally. The degree to which people have noticed stuff, they've taken in that it's going badly. 60%, 70% of people say it's going badly. They think it's going to get worse. They have absolutely no faith whatsoever in Theresa May or any of her ministers. Theresa May looks good if you compare her to David Davis, but terrible compared to anyone else. By the way, they also have very low confidence in Jeremy Corbyn. I know there are bits of London like this where Corbyn's quite popular, but on the whole, the British public do not like Corbyn at all. He's massively overestimated for the public. And most people think we'll get a bad deal. And then my two favourite sort of findings, because they are fascinating. 70% of people think that Brexit has been harder and more difficult than they expected it to be. And 70% of people think it's distracting from Britain's real problems, which are both, I think, reasonable descriptions of where we are. So that means actually there's quite a lot of people who are potentially open-minded to voting for Remain who didn't last time. The challenge we have, though, is that most people, when they look at Brexit being bad, don't think it will be bad for them. And in an audience like this, where I'm sure a lot of people here have jobs or other things that connect them quite closely to Europe, for most people, Brexit doesn't obviously affect their everyday life because they work for a shop that, you know, is a shop on the high street or a hairdresser. And that is a real challenge. So we're sort of well on the way to winning, actually, at the moment already, but the margin is uncomfortably tight. Who the people are, we need to motivate to vote in a future referendum. And there are, broadly speaking, 3 big groups, each of which is between about 2 and 4 million people. The first one of which is the Conservative Remainers. These are sort of people who are sort of fairly centrist Tory voters. They probably voted for us in the 2000s sometimes they voted Conservative, relatively liberal. There were people around here, the Conservatives you have around here will be a bit like this. They tend to be in sort of international jobs or professional jobs there of working age, relatively liberal social views, and remaining actually fitted with their view of the world quite nicely. And they loved Cameron. And the danger, there's a couple of dangers at the moment. Firstly, those people are terrified of Corbyn because he is against many of their beliefs in various ways. Not with liberalism, but more the sort of hard left stuff really scares those people. And a lot of them may even vote for Brexit next time because they see it as a way of stopping Corbyn. So I think that's actually the Labour message that they need a general election is actually a really unhelpful message for winning a referendum. And this Conservative group is drifting towards Brexit because there's no longer any political leadership from the Conservatives. When Cameron was Prime Minister and saying vote Remain, they liked Cameron, that was easy. There's now no Conservative these people really know saying vote Remain. And these people won't be engaged enough to know about Anna Soubry and people. So that's one group of people. Quite hard to identify around here. A lot more of them are home counties, where in lots of places like Maidenhead, will be huge numbers of people like this. But there are four things, just to mention them if you do come across any, who will matter to this group. First one of which is the economy, because they're very internationally exposed jobs they get, why Brexit will damage them. Secondly, security. This group does notice and care about Putin murdering people in Britain. And this group is willing to accept that Putin is pro-Brexit, because he is. Thirdly, actually, I think the health service. Almost all groups actually care about the NHS, and the arguments for the NHS are really good. All London hospitals have about 1 in 6 staff from the EU. So you can confidently say your local hospital has 1 in 6. I checked Whittington, it was 1 in 6. And then finally, the people they know who can persuade them will be their European friends and neighbours. Now, many of you will have, or be, European close friends or neighbours, or be from the European Union. Talking to people you know about it is incredibly powerful. And we all kind of underestimate this, but it's actually incredibly powerful. And just gently saying how you feel. So people like saying, so I feel worried that my, I don't know if I'll be able to stay long term, and I don't know what's going to happen. You don't have to be angry or shouty, just talking about it is incredibly powerful. And I think a lot of this Tory Remainer group will have European friends and neighbours around. Second big group is the Labour leavers. This is a group we've heard a lot more about, I think, which are basically the people who, there are fewer of them in London generally, but this group is predominantly more Labour than Leaver. So they voted Leaver as a sort of kick to the establishment. This group also worries about the economy a lot, but they worry about it at a much more practical, personal level because they're much less well off than the Tory Remainers. This group also is renters, so sort of people when we canvass who've often just moved in. Hard to get at, obviously, because they're often out having fun in London. You don't have kids yet. And this group's actually essential that we get them registered to vote and motivated to vote. Now, I think the motivation will probably be less of a problem than last time, because I think if we have another referendum, it will be the biggest political event Britain has seen in 70 years. So I don't think motivating will necessarily be much of a problem, but I think getting people registered to vote is important, because between a campaign being called and the last time people can register might be quite a short period. So making sure that whenever you talk to anyone on a street stall, they probably won't be the unregistered people because they won't be motivated enough to come talk to you. But if you say to them, do you have any young friends and relatives? Make sure they're registered to vote. Make sure students know they can be registered both at home and at university. That group is potentially very large and it's quite hard work to get at them, but there's huge numbers of votes out there. And if people are under 30, the chance of them voting for Remain is about 70 or 80%. So we don't really need to worry about converting them, we just need to get them registered. So that's who we can persuade. So just coming towards the end. Just in summary, firstly, I think we should all feel really optimistic about where we are. We actually have a chance of stopping it, a chance that seemed almost impossible if I'd been here 2 years ago. So I sort of the next few months will show what happens. Secondly, if you're talking to anyone doing anything and you can't remember anything else, just talk about the economy and the NHS. Those two things, particularly if you can make them local, will really have an impact. The third one of which is use your own personal expertise. Like the more you talk to people from your heart about what you feel, the more you're a reasonable person, you just have a dialogue with them, the more that people will be persuaded by you. Particularly if you're an EU citizen, but even if you're not, just your personal experience, your story is great. Yeah, those sorts of stories are great. And then the final thing really is, when you're talking to people, try and make sure as much as possible you allow them lots of space to talk to you and you listen. Because a lot of the people who voted for Leave felt they weren't listened to. And a lot of the debate about Brexit ever since has felt actually quite patronising to them. And they still quite feel patronised by people who voted Remain. But if you just nicely listen to them for 10 minutes, get stuff off their chest, often that will be cathartic for them and they will actually be then ready to move on. And if we go back to 70% who think it's a bit of a disaster, a lot of those people are ready to come and vote for Remain. And if we can get them to switch, then we've got a pretty good chance of winning. Thank you. So I think a lot of the time, trying to argue somebody out of a deeply held opinion is not completely pointless, but if you, I think if people believe it's true, they need to find their own way to that most of the time. So I would almost try and go to the other things that convince them, because that's probably the hardest possible way of convincing them. Because most of us don't like to admit, in the same way as I tried to persuade everyone in this room to vote Leave tomorrow, I suspect I would convince none of you. But if I tried to convince you of one bad thing the EU has done that you could all get on board with, I could probably find something that you would disagree with. And I could probably persuade you of that. And then that might start to open the door to you thinking differently. Switching somebody's mind on something they've believed for a long time is really hard compared to persuading them to also, it's much easier to persuade somebody to buy into, it's going to be a mess, isn't it? Because they probably already believe that. And once you've got them to agree that, then you can get them to agree, well, do you think it might be sensible to avoid that mess? But I think it's switching somebody on something they already believe very firmly on is hard. By the way, on immigration, there's quite a good example of this, where 2/3, 3/4 of the British population believe there should be less immigration. But if you talk to them about specific types of immigration, people actually are pretty comfortable with them. People are pretty comfortable with students. They're pretty comfortable with the NHS. They're pretty comfortable with people who've been here a long time. Actually, there's a big gap between the theoretical and the real for people. So I think a lot of people are quite, in fact, there's been a lot of research on this recently. Most people are what the academics call balancers on immigration. In other words, they are absolutely fine with immigration as long as they feel Britain gets benefits as well as some costs, because there obviously are some costs of immigration. There's actually only about 1 in 5 people in Britain are basically anti-immigration on principle. And there's about another 1 in 5 who are sort of pro-immigration on principle. But there's a huge chunk in the middle, 60% of the population who basically are actually okay with immigration in the right circumstances. And so, again, the reason we're always going to be, in the short term, we're going to be on a back foot on immigration. But that's probably a more defensive thing, which actually, to your point, if somebody asks about it, I think it's okay to say, look, people actually can claim benefits here, but they claim under the same system as British citizens. The difference in Britain and other EU countries have different systems for claiming benefits. So some of them mean you have to work for a certain number of years before you can claim anything. But you're not going to probably flip anyone around that. And I don't think we're going to gain anyone in immigration. But what we can do is at least listen to people on it. And as you say, talk about bits that they like. Because almost everyone buys into the NHS point, actually. Age is a very, very strong indicator of people's support for Remain or Leave. But it's like, actually the only thing stronger is education. But it's very, very hard to do a canvas list of people by education because we don't know what people's education levels are. But age, actually, we can tell. So broadly speaking, if you're less from retirement age, you're persuadable. People above retirement age just tend not to change their mind very often. By the way, just on language, talking about a final vote, a final say, or people's vote, all fine. Just don't use a referendum word. And there's a really important reason for that, which is people hear that and they think, oh yeah, you're asking for best of free. Oh yeah, they just think, oh, you lost last time, you want to try again this time. Well, yeah, but it just sounds like we're bad losers, and British people hate bad losers.
I think both sets are really silly things to say.
But this is,
not the same question.
but yeah, it isn't the same question. You're right, but the final say is really important because it reminds people this is irreversible. Because most people kind of frame this in their heads when they think about it as being like buying a house, so that if it all goes wrong, nothing will happen. Not if it all goes wrong, I'm suddenly committed to having bought this house. And that's actually quite a challenge, because I think a lot of people don't realise that the default is no deal disaster. The politicians know that now, and they're quite worried.